It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we're going to discuss some new updates with the antitrust suit. We had some judgments come down from the Honorable Judge Boulware on Thursday, and we had a trial of sorts on Friday. So, John, how the hell are you?
Good. Just to be clear, not a trial, a hearing.
A hearing,
Friday.
excuse me. So you've been doing good since our last episode 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. I don't know what happened those 2 weeks. I can't remember, but been busy, but good. Did you watch the fights yesterday?
I did. I didn't think Jonas won. Did you?
I don't know. I thought it was close. I didn't know who won. I wasn't paying close enough attention to know who won.
Mayor won. I need a rematch immediately, but
I wouldn't mind. It was exciting, but I was not. I didn't really enjoy the UFC event.
See, I didn't either. How about that?
I thought the fights are, not everyone can be winner, but I thought they were boring. Even the main event, which a lot of people went nuts for, I thought was not.
Thank you.
It's just not good. It was ugly, and I thought, man, Anderson Silva in his prime would have terminated these two guys.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing was that for 2 solid rounds, it looked like a sparring match that had random moments of action. It wasn't until well into round 3 when it really picked up momentum and became a little bit more action-packed. But I am right there with you. If I had to rate that event on a scale of 1 to 5, I'd give it maybe a 2.
Yeah, it was very mediocre.
Yeah,
not awful, but mediocre.
I agree 100%. You and me, we eye to eye, sir. So why don't you explain exactly what we got on Thursday and then tell us what happened on Friday, and then we'll go into the questions and breaking it down to its little bits.
Well, Thursday, there was a few outstanding motions and things happening Thursday. They're still outstanding in the antitrust. If you're listening to the Lee versus Zuffa antitrust case, there was a few outstanding things separating where we were in a potential trial. And there was a few motions, a motion for summary judgment that the defendants had put in, requesting that the judge determine that there's no merit to the case and throw it out, and a couple motions to exclude the experts from the plaintiff's experts from the case.
Are those last few outstanding motions that they were waiting for, was that anything that could have derailed or delayed a trial?
Yeah, that's exactly what. In fact, they seemed a little bit like last-ditch efforts because they'd done these requests earlier, right? Mm-hmm. And the judge had already made it clear on summary judgment he wasn't probably going to grant it. So for the motion of summary judgment, they refiled it. They had submitted it earlier, and the judge.
Let's tell fresh listeners what summary judgment is again.
Well, a summary judgment is basically you're asking the judge to make a judgment because the case is basically meritless, right? No one could reasonably find in favor of the plaintiff's requests. So that was it. And obviously the judge had already determined that he had found merit in the case. The defendants in this case were contending that there's no facts that need to be decided. There was all the evidence is there. And that everybody agrees on the facts, and that the judge can make a judgment right there. And the judge had already said he kind of disagreed, so that was a given. And now we had a clear ruling by the judge that he had thrown that out. And he had written, in his decision was kind of interesting because it gave some insight, because he had given some more clear language that he'd found that the plaintiffs had made strong case and evidence on made a strong case on a lot of the evidence, and a lot of their evidence was in their favor for the trial. So the plaintiffs got to look at that and think that's very favorable to them, that the judge views the evidence as favorable to them.
And what about Friday?
Well, Friday we had a hearing because Thursday, the other thing I forgot to mention is that Thursday, there was also 2 motions to exclude experts. Zuffa wanted to exclude the experts of Professor Halsinger, and Andrew Ziblis, 2 of the key, especially Halsinger, the key expert witnesses whose testimony, they want to exclude their testimony from the case. And the judge ruled against him in that. on that regard.
When
on
you say
Friday,
expert witnesses, what exactly is their area of expertise? Is it economy?
they're both economists. Halsinger's an econometrician. He ran a regression model. What he had done is probably the key to the case. He showed in a model, which Paul Gift, my show money co-host, he thinks just doesn't work at all. But he has a model that shows that the UFC, by foreclosing other promotions and foreclosing, in other words, signing and locking into contracts more top-ranked fighters, they get a bigger share of the market because of that. So that's the key evidence for them, showing that how the UFC attained their monopoly power. And Zimbalist basically did a bunch of yardstick comparisons between other sports and boxing to make the claim that the UFC should be paying much higher percentages based on what other sports pay. So that's what both those guys did. And then on Friday, they had a separate hearing for Guy Davis, who basically is just an accountant. In fact, we had a whole episode discussing his report and basically breakdown showing that the UFC had the money, the financial means to pay fighters more without losing money. And so they tried to exclude that evidence. The judge, did make a clear ruling on. He deferred it for now. Into the future, will that judge's testimony, will that expert's testimony be permitted or not?
Why would he put that off? Why would he delay it or defer it?
I guess the key is how key is his evidence to the case, right? I wasn't at the hearing. I'm just going off notes that other people gave me. But my guess would be, this is just a guess, my gut instinct, is Guy Davis's report ain't key to the case. It doesn't show how the UFC attained monopoly power. It doesn't show how they abused it. All it shows is they had a lot of money and could have paid more. So I guess that evidence is only important if the UFC claims that they couldn't afford to pay more, that they were basically broke, right? And so if the UFC makes that argument in court, then I could see him saying, hey, we're going to let Guy Davis's evidence come into play. But if the UFC, the defendants, don't make the argument that they didn't have the financial means to pay the fighters, instead focus their efforts on that we didn't have to pay them more because we didn't abuse our monopoly power, then that evidence won't be permitted because it's not necessary.
So when is the trial and how long is it expected to last?
Well, that was the other thing on the hearing. They had a schedule for us. The trial's date is set. Originally it was going to be April 8th. They moved it back a week. April 15th it's going to happen. Okay. So we're going to have UFC 300 on that Saturday, the April 13th. 2 days later, we're going to start jury selection. And both parties, the defendants and the plaintiffs, agree that the trial should take about 4 weeks total.
So what happens between now and the trial?
Well, between now and then, there's no real motions that are being filed. They're outstanding. What we can expect to happen is both sides are going to be working to basically get their case ready for trial. So they're probably going to bring in potential people that are going to testify, that they're going to bring them in and do maybe mock sessions. They're going to go through mock juries, to determine what's the best evidence present and see how the jury views it. They're going to do just a bunch of do all their notes, get their evidence ready, all the little stuff that you got to do to get ready for a case.
I saw an interview with Dana White and they asked him about the antitrust case coming up. And he said, I don't think about that. I don't think about that at all. But should he be thinking about that?
Well, I think he definitely should be thinking about it because I think there's a chance that he's going to be called to testify, to appear in court and testify in court because he's such a key player. If he doesn't testify, at the very least, they're going to bring up his deposition. They're going to, bring up the transcripts or play tape of the deposition in the trial and bring up evidence of his presentation. But as someone that's in charge of the UFC, not only should he be thinking about because he might testify, you think he'd be thinking about too because it could change the way we do business if they lose the case. So I don't know if I 100% buy the argument that he doesn't think about it. I think it's a great way for him not to talk about it, which I'm sure the attorneys like not having him not talk about it.
Yeah, because he routinely steps in it a little bit when he talks about how nobody can compete with the UFC. tries to walk it back a little bit. I'm happy for the PFL after he first said, one shit organization bought another shit organization. Like a week later, not even a week later, he kind of walked it back. I'm happy for PFL.
Oh yeah, it was. A prime example is when the defendants, the UFC's attorneys, they filed a motion asking to open discovery again because they're claiming we have all this evidence that all these other promotions now are major competitors to the UFC, and they make this argument, and then you have Dana White the next day saying these guys are trash, they can't sell, they're losers. Yeah. And then those very comments appear in the plaintiff's rebuttal to that to that motion a week later. So I'm sure a lot of attorneys were like, hey, listen, you gotta pipe down when we're making filings like this.
Put a sock in it. So will it be a jury or the judge that determines this case?
Well, it could be either, but in this case, they're going to go with jury. It's going to be a jury trial, so they're going to have to bring some, just regular people in, which opens up its own can of worms. But they're going to have regular people in to determine the
back up. Let's back up. You can't say opens up its own can of worms and then just skip forward. We need to know the can of worms.
I was leaving that. I was just saying that one sentence. I'm going to have you go bring it up again, but that's all right.
I'm going to have to. Come on now. I have to ask you, can they get a fair and impartial jury in Las Vegas?
That's a question. Big question. You'd think they should be able to. I mean, it's a big city. There's a lot of people that have some connections to, I'm sure a lot of people have connections to either the UFC or Fertitta Enterprises, or they know about the UFC in Vegas, but they should be able to find someone, right? You'd think so. I mean, the thing is, too, is it's also to the benefit. There might be a lot of people in Las Vegas that are partial to the UFC and the Fertitta, but there also might be a lot of people that don't like them for various reasons. That have had bad experiences with them. So, it's going to work both ways. But the other thing, it's going to be a hard part for the defendants is, in many cases, a jury trial is risky because regular people don't not like big businesses when you do lawsuits against businesses. So there is that positive for the jury. I mean, for the plaintiffs.
So back on track now.
Yes.
How big a difference does it make that it is a jury?
I think it makes a massive difference because if it's just a bench trial with a judge ruling, you can get a lot more technical probably, right? And you can get to the just going through the math and regressions and all that stuff. It can be a lot more intricate a trial. With a jury, you've got to focus on what sells them. A narration. Can we get them to understand this math? Can we get them to understand these concepts we're talking about? So that's a big ask. So, I mean, in one way too, it's hard to get people to understand, just regular people and even fans who follow this. This is a major divide. I know, like, how do you convince people the UFC did something wrong when other businesses do the same thing the UFC does, right? So you have to convince them because the UFC buying other promotions do that. Not a big deal. UFC contracts, the other promotions have basically identical contracts. What is it that makes the UFC different than these other promotions? Why is it when the UFC does it and the others do it, it's not illegal, but it's illegal that the UFC does it? You have to explain why that is, and you have to get you have to find a way to explain to the jury and get them to understand it if you're the plaintiffs, and for the defendants, you got to find a way to explain that what we're doing is no different than the other promotions. So and that really does matter.
Okay. What is at stake and what is the potential outcome here?
Well, there's a lot at stake, right? Because it could have big repercussions in the industry. I mean, really, it's also, there's not nearly much at stake as there possibly could be, because this trial, the jury, it's only damages that are up at this trial. That's the only thing that's on the table. So if the UFC loses and the jury decides that the expert witness's evaluation of damage is correct, somewhere from 811 to 1.6 billion, and it goes all the way through a trial and they lose, not only do they have to pay those damages, it gets trebled because it's an antitrust case. So you're talking a massive amount of damages. Now, the UFC makes so much money now, they could probably take a loan to cover any of the damages, and they could afford to pay the loan. But that still would be a big hit to their business. And we saw reports come out recently how a lot of they view that the stock price could potentially take a hurt, the TKO stock, because of the outcome of this case, that the damages could lead to lower profits, less dividends, stuff like that. And it's very true. If they lose this case, they have a mass amount of damages. What they don't have, though, is injunctive relief on the table, which is probably a greater threat. And the attorney for the UFC brought that up, that injunctive relief is not on the table, so our business model is not at stake. Which is funny because a lot of people think the injunctive relief is not a big deal to the UFC. And I'm like, well, there's their lead attorney saying how important is the business model to their stock price, right? So obviously it's pretty important. So injunctive relief is not on the table, but if they lose the trial, well, there's another trial after this, the Johnson v. Zuffa case, which is almost identical, but covers the period from 2017 on. Injunctive relief is on the table. So if they lose this, not only have to pay a lot of money, now the Johnson case seems much more likely to potentially have a victory because they have the precedent to this case, and they have injunctive relief now on the table and the threat of the business model being changed. So there's just a tremendous amount at stake right here.
Potential outcome.
Well, I guess potential outcome is there's just a wide variety. One is we could still very well see a settlement before the trial starts, even during the trial, based on how it seems to be going. We could see the plaintiffs win, in which case they get a large amount of damages because it'd be trebled. We could see the defendants win, in which case the case is over. We'd still have appeal by either party no matter what happens afterwards. But the primary trial would be over, and that'd be it. And then there's the possibility, another potential outcome, of course, is that the Johnson case goes forward based on how this one does. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But there's a wide variety of outcomes. I still think even if the plaintiffs win, I think there's a chance we could even see a settlement after the plaintiffs win, because the UFC could go to them and say, we will pay you a lot of money, just not the tremendously huge amount that you won. But that way you don't have to go through the appeal and risk it, worried that that you could lose an appeal. Of course, if a jury determines your favor, it's usually less likely to be overturned in an appeal. But still, I think even that's a possibility. UFC could be waiting after a trial and say, if we lose, then we'll try to settle.
All right. So that's going to wrap that portion up. I do want to touch down really quickly on Saudi Arabia for a quick moment, because we had some rumors, some gossip, some grapes rotting on the MMA grapevine that Saudi Arabia was not happy with the card that the UFC offered them. And so the UFC ends up having to move that card to June. Dana White has come out and said, no, that's not true. But kind of looks smelly when Ariel Helwani comes out with the report, and we all know he has like a direct line to what's his name, Turki Al-Sheikh, I think is his name, Turki Al-Sheikh. So he's got a direct line to this man. So he releases that, and then all of a sudden the UFC, sure as shit, they have moved the event. So what do you make of all of this? Is Saudi pulling the strings already?
Well, it does sound like it does. Dana White's story seems somewhat unbelievable because he did say we didn't have the fights ready, the fights available, which is basically, okay, it's not because we didn't, they wanted better fights. We didn't have the fights available. Aren't you saying the same thing just differently? Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what it sounded like to me. So it seems Saudi Arabia is giving them $20 million for a site fee for one event, for a fight night, not a pay-per-view. So you could see them having some input and saying, we're trying to make it prestige events in Saudi Arabia. We just don't want garbage. So there could be some quality standard there. Like the rumor always has been that the ESPN part of the pay-per-view deal was that there'd always be, except for exceptions that would be, brought to ESPN to approve, that every pay-per-view would have a title fight on it. Right. So there'd be some quality control. So there's probably some quality control mechanism where Saudi Arabia gets some approval right. But it's interesting is we're talking about, monopoly power and stuff. And this kind of is a demonstration of the UFC having some form of monopoly power, because if you look at it, we're always told that the fighters don't matter, right? And yet here's an example where the fighters matter because Saudi Arabia does not want that fight without better fighters. And so obviously the fighters matter. You can't just throw anybody in the UFC brand because it's not worth $20 million from Saudi Arabia for that. So the fighters matter, but because UFC has lockdown on so many fighters, what fighter can ask for more money to be on that card? They can't, because the UFC can just go to the next guy or the next guy and the next guy until they find someone to take that fight. And so that kind of is great demonstration. This event is somewhat of a great demonstration of the monopoly power the UFC has over fighters, because even though they have importance and value, because this event, Saudi doesn't want to pay without good fighters in this card, they don't have the power like they do in boxing to say this fight only goes on because you have quality fighters, pay me more. So I thought that part was interesting.
One more question here, and it's way out. So I'm spitballing bonus questions here for our people, for our listeners. Conor McGregor. Dana White came out and said Conor won't be fighting in June. So that leads me to think end of June, going into July. Maybe he's saying now he's not fighting on International Fight Week. Now, I don't know if he's saying that because they haven't been able to strike a deal or what, but he did say when Conor's ready to fight, we'll let you know. And I know that Conor signed a new deal in 2018 and he's had 4 fights and it's a 6-fight deal. So explain how it goes down if we think he has a sunset clause, because that would sort of fall in those same parameters, that same time frame. But I want to hear what you have to say about Conor's deal and what may be going on and when he might be able to extricate himself if he wanted to.
You got to imagine something's going on, because Conor says he wants to fight. He's been demanding to fight, making videos saying he's upset. UFC keeps pushing it. I mean, the theories is the UFC, that they can't give him a fight because he's, jacked to the bone with whatever substance. That's one theory. The other theory is that they have some contractual dispute and they don't want to give him a fight because maybe they don't want his contract to be up, want him to resign, whatever. There's potentially a lot of stuff, but you'd assume because he signed his contract in 2018, a new contract in fall of 2018 before fighting Khabib, all the contracts I've seen from that period had a sunset clause, and it does not quite make sense if you think the purpose of that sunset clause inserted that time was because of the antitrust lawsuit, that you wanted to demonstrate that no one's locked up perpetual in their contracts, that you would not include it in Conor McGregor's contract, because you'd want to include it in everyone. Otherwise, the attorneys could point out and say, you still did not put it in the key assets, the top guys' contracts, which are the most important guys. So that would defeat the purpose of it. So you'd assume it's in there. Now, why doesn't Conor McGregor exercise that sunset clause? Well, one possibility is he submitted retirement, and that's why he was able to take substances that would be illegal, and that's why he wasn't tested by USADA during that period, because he took a retirement period. But the contract also says, all the standard contracts, that retirement period is a separate period from the sunset clause. If you're under contract and you just turn fights down, at least the old Ngannou style contract, the contract's around from 2017 to 2020, 21, that range, you could just turn fights down and just refuse to fight and the 5-year period be up. But if you retire, it says if you retire, that starts another a different 5-year period. And so it's possible that he took a retirement, didn't think this through, and the UFC is pointing out, no, because you were retired for 2 years, you have 2 more years in additional to that 5-year sunset. That's one possibility.
Wait, can I ask one question?
Yep.
I have a question since listening. He still has 2 fights on the contract. Doesn't he have to fight those out before the sunset clause kicks in?
Well, no, he doesn't have to fight out all his fights. No, the sunset clause is 5 years after signing it. In fact, Ngannou, he has a Harvard case study. He has they interviewed him for that Harvard case study. And one of his comments in that was, he knew that he was told by all of his attorneys, everybody, that he didn't even have to fight that last fight, that 8th fight on his contract, to get out of it. He just did it, so there would be no excuses for them. That's what he said. I decided to do the 8th, so they couldn't say I didn't honor my agreement. But I didn't even have to fight that Gone fight. I could have just waited out the last year and then let my sunset clause kick in and leave. But he decided to go out and, I guess for whatever reasons, finish his contract because he thought it showed him be a man of his word. But for McGregor, because there's not a sunset, he probably has also built up a ton of, there's probably just a ton of ways they can extend the contract, because he's probably had fights offered he turned down, all these other periods that they can delay it as long as possible. And they could also delay it up to the full length of the contract and then just pay him what they owe him if they wanted to. There's nothing, as you know, we've talked about before, it doesn't say they have to give you 3 fights, right?
Right.
It just says you have to give an offer of fights within a certain period. And so if he retired for a while and they're looking at his contract length, they might have time based on previous extensions to let him sit for a year or so before they even have to offer him a fight. So, I mean, like I said, and then the other possibility I've heard this, who knows, is that there's a possibility that some of his money or something, or a bonus or whatever, either some of his money from the Mayweather fight or some bonus if he finished his contract was written into the contract. And so McGregor doesn't just want to leave. He wants to finish it so he can get that money that's been sitting there. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just a theory someone presented, but it seems plausible for why he doesn't, exercise the sunset if it's there available. But that's another possibility. But other than that, we don't know for sure. But something seems to be going on, because here's a guy that apparently wants to fight. And by the period he has a contract, you'd almost assume that he has a sunset clause, unless, again, he sent in a retirement letter, which is very possible.
Would he have to send a retirement letter, or would he be able to just call someone or do one of his infamous tweets, "I'm retired"?
Well, the UFC might be able to claim that, but you could probably take it to court. But I think it says in the we have to look. We did a show on the contract. We have to double check. But if I remember right, it's a written notice that you're retiring.
Okay. So if the UFC tried to point to those silly things, they would probably get shot down.
They might, but again, I don't know if his contract, the contract at that time didn't seem to have an arbitration clause, but maybe his did, but the new ones have an arbitration, so you'd have to go to arbitration. So, but his old one shouldn't have that. It just seems for a guy and also a guy of his demand, because Saudi Arabia already said they'd like to see him box in Saudi Arabia. Remember that recently? And so he has options outside the UFC. Right. And Nate Diaz is no longer in the UFC. So if he could leave the UFC, it's not like he wouldn't have fights. Him and Nate Diaz could fight in MMA somewhere, probably make pretty good money, sell enough to make good money, or he could go box in Saudi Arabia and probably get a huge fee from them that would pay him as much as him fighting in the UFC. So it's not like he doesn't have options outside the UFC. So he's one of the few fighters that actually has major options outside the UFC. And but yet he's still intent on finishing his contract. So that tells me either he can't get out of his contract, or that there's some sort of bonus waiting at the end of that contract and he wants to finish it.
Well, all right. That pretty much wraps us up for the day. John, why don't you tell everybody where to find you and what you have coming up?
Well, you can find me in Hollywood. But at Los Angeles, I go to the movie theaters here a lot. So you can probably find me at the Chinese theater down the street, or the Egyptian for old revivals. I shouldn't have probably said that, because I'll probably get some weirdo coming in to attack me over something. But because I'm woke or some weird shit like that, or I'm not woke, or whatever weird crap you people are into now. And then also find me at Hey Not the Face on Twitter, and the Bloody Elbows Substack, where I will have an article out about the rulings last week, and then another piece about basically looking at UFC event revenue compared to fighter costs and things like that.
Awesome. Well, there you have it, folks. The amazing John Nash. That's going to wrap us up. Y'all know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!